Are you struggling to reduce your cybersecurity risks and meet compliance mandates? Wishing you could be proactive instead of reactive? You need a solution that integrates cybersecurity together to make it affordable, accessible from anywhere, and simplistic, so you can gain a return on investment on your resources. Cyrisma is your answer. It gives you a single interface to identify sensitive data, vulnerable systems, insecure configurations, track progress, and assign accountability. Visit securityweekly.com/Cyrisma today for a 7-day test drive and impress your leadership. That's Cyrisma, Cyrisma. RSA offers business-driven security solutions that provide organizations with a unified approach to managing digital risk and designed to effectively detect and respond to advanced attacks, manage user access control, and reduce business risk, fraud, and cybercrime. For a limited time, get mobile multi-factor authentication from RSA Secure ID Access for free to help secure your remote or dynamic workforce long-term. Leverage push notification, biometric, and one-time password authenticators to secure access to your cloud applications, on-premises systems, legacy systems, privileged accounts, and more at no cost for 6 months. For more information, visit securityweekly.com/RSA Security. Did you know that over 63% of cyber breaches are caused by a third-party vendor? CyberGRX is on a mission to modernize third-party cyber risk management. Built on the market's first third-party cyber risk exchange, CyberGRX arms you with fast and accurate data, a proven and innovative approach, so you can make rapid, informed decisions and confidently engage with partners. Learn how partnering with CyberGRX will help you become cyber certain. Visit securityweekly.com/CyberGRX.
And welcome back to Security and Compliance Weekly. Hey, it's official. Security Weekly, in partnership with Cyber Risk Alliance, is excited to present Security Weekly Unlocked on December 10th, 2020. The inaugural edition of Security Weekly Unlocked also celebrates Security Weekly's 15th anniversary. Registration will open soon, but open already is our call for speakers. If you're interested in speaking at Unlocked, go to securityweekly.com/unlocked and submit your CFP. Also, coming up on October 22nd, we're going to have a technical training. It's going to provide a first look at a new free resource that delivers thousands of remedies as a service to bridge the gap between vulnerabilities found and vulnerabilities fixed. That sounds vaguely familiar to our topic we're about to jump into. Visit securityweekly.com/webcast to see what we have coming up, and visit securityweekly.com/on-demand to view our previously recorded webcasts and technical trainings. All right, let's jump into it. What we've all been waiting for and what we've already been discussing since before we started broadcasting over on the Discord server. Last week, I think it was Josh that actually first brought up the question, and I'm going to flip this over to you in just a minute, Josh, if that's all right. But
Sure.
we got into this sort of, I don't know if it was heated, let's say animated discussion about a couple different things, but all sort of rolled around the idea of vulnerability management, vulnerability remediation, patching, risk mitigation, vulnerability mitigation, timing, prioritization. And I picked up on it because of prioritization, because that's been sort of a pet peeve industry buzzword that I've been liking to beating up on the last, I don't know, a couple months or so. But I thought, well, we've been having such a great conversation on Discord. Why don't we pull it into and talk about it live? So that's what we're going to do. So, Josh, let me flip it over to you, since I think you started it all, like you usually do, and let's take it from there.
Okay. Well, I do start things only with you, Jeff. It's so amusing to watch you sort of go, "Oh, really?" But anyway, so to be honest,
I've got slides, by the way. As soon as you start talking PCI, I'm ready for you. But go ahead.
You got it. But let me sort of intro this. So my wife, Janice Paulson, is also in the business, and we were talking because we're weird about how vulnerability remediation timelines are created. In other words, how fast should you remediate a critical, a high, a medium, a low? What's the scientific basis of saying you've got 7 days to do this and 30 days to do that? And we came to the conclusion that we could find literally zero scientific evidence that if you take a critical and let it go on the 8th day, you're dead, or whatever, like the Ring or whatever, that videotape. And it was weird because we're like, wow, we've never talked about this. A friend of ours, Sandy Clark Mouse, had done a talk many, many, many years ago about the Red Queen's race, is what she called it. She actually was doing this when Firefox, and I think it was Firefox, was doing rapid release on their browser. And she actually found out that because they were doing rapid release, the vulnerability creators, the exploit creators, not the vulnerability creators, didn't have time to create exploits against that code because the next release was literally around the corner. If I remember correctly, it was every 6 weeks they were replacing 2/3 of the code in the browser. Okay, so they just didn't have time to create. Actually, the only successful exploits that were out there, sort of in the wild, were against the long-term release candidates. So what's interesting is you've got this remediation timelines that everybody's spouting, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 7, 14, 30, whatever, with no good reason behind it. Now that's fascinating. Now that expands. Is there a scientific reason, basis, plan for why you prioritize some vulns over others? Not really. Is there a scientific basis, reason, plan for offsets? And what do I mean by offsets? If you have a scoring, and we all know scoring, it's based on impact if it hits, and how easy is it to perform, okay? So severity and ease of actually exploitation. But what about the offsets? Well, what's an offset? Well, I've got a firewall that blocks this vulnerability entirely. Can I throw this one to the bottom of the pile? As Gene Eric on Discord, we've already been talking about this since before the show actually started today. That's how interesting this topic is. He's like, if he or she, forgive me, Gene, I don't know who you are, but if it's at the bottom of the pile, eventually it will be gotten to. And I'm like, well, that depends on budget. And Gene's like, well, it depends on maturity. Anyway, long story short, how do you score? I have a firewall. I have a compensating controller. Jeff, what'd you call it instead of a compensating control?
A mitigation or a countermeasure.
Thank you. So a mitigation, a countermeasure, a compensating control, different names, but we're on the same sort of track. You know what I mean? And how do you score that? How do you change the score? And does that change the prioritization? And so doing, does that change the timeline? Where is the scientific basis, the studies that have actually been done to determine those offsets, those prioritizations, those timelines? And that's really the topic. And it's fascinating because nobody online in Discord, none of the research I've done a bit of Google searching, has really shown me any good scientific research. So I'll shut up there and Jeff, take it away.
But Josh, there's a formula. Jeff, do you have that?
I do have a formula, and hopefully it's.
I think that was a setup.
It was a setup.
It was a setup.
Well, so I want to give a little bit of context and sort of, because I think, to be quite honest, I think PCI has impacted a lot of or necessitated a lot of the need for this type of discussion. And I think it's a fascinating topic. All in the context, and this goes back to our first segment with Cyrisma, talking about risk, vulnerabilities, threats, and, as I said, countermeasures. This is the risk equation the way I learned it back in my NSA days, back in the almost 30 years ago.
Cool. And it's adorable, but it's wrong.
No, it's not wrong. It's simplified.
It is 100%
wrong. Wrong about it.
No,
there's no.
All right, Josh, I'll take the bait. How is it wrong?
Well, I mean, okay, the equation as it stands is perfectly fine. I love this as a thought experiment, but it's not an equation.
Okay, then let's move on.
You can't put numbers in there. Give me numbers. Give me something I can actually measure.
I agree with that. And that's why I simplify. I simplify to, and I don't even get into, usually when I present this at a talk, I say, Google, you can find 1,000 mathematical formulas that attempt to come up with a value. And I think, forget about that. Just understand the concept that we're trying to reduce
in
risk.
That sense.
And the implication is you've got variables that contribute to whatever this mythical value is. I think we agree it's a mythical value of risk. And most of our industry, frankly, is grown up around discover all the vulnerabilities and knock them out. And that's the variable that we can impact the most within this equation. And would you agree, Josh, that most of our industry has grown up around that concept or that preconceived notion?
No, we're on the same page here. Absolutely. Okay. Yeah. Okay. This is a fascinating thing because if we can't quantify it, can we actually talk about it intelligibly?
So the equation that we're talking about, for those of you who can't see what we're referencing,
is risk equals vulnerabilities plus threats minus countermeasures. In my own humble opinion, there are two major factors that are missing out of this equation that should invalidate a lot of what we know. And the two factors are money and time. Whether they're a multiplier or divider.
And I'm not a mathematician, but there's certainly something that should be added to the equation. And I even hesitate to use, I use the simplest math available. And I usually describe that risk is a function of all your vulnerabilities and all your threats, hopefully reduced by something that I was classically trained as being countermeasures, but you could substitute mitigation, remediation, even security. I mean, because this is what we're all about, and the idea of security isn't even in here. But I suggest that security is what we do to try to reduce vulnerabilities, reduce threats, so that our overall risk is lowered. So
realistically, it should be risk as a function of security, right? Instead of just saying risk equals this.
Yeah, it's a function of all these things, not just security. It's a function of all these things, not an equals. And that's where the math begins to get derailed, which is why I agree with Josh that trying to put value on this. But let me paint another small context in why I think PCI impacts this, and that's because. Hopefully my screen will advance. There we go.
Yeah, you got it.
In the PCI world, for those companies that have to do PCI, there's various activities that refer to vulnerabilities and remediation. There's internal vulnerability scanning, external vulnerability scanning, penetration testing, and web application testing. So from the bottom up, web application testing, you get the check, you're compliant if you've addressed everything that shows up in the OWASP Top 10 at a minimum. And effectively at a minimum means that's all people look at. Just bear with me. Penetration testing perspective, we've already discussed this on the Discord channel. It's supposed to be all the exploitable vulnerabilities, correct them, mitigate them, address them, you pass the pen test. External scanning, this is very regimented because PCI requires an external third party called an approved scanning vendor or ASV to perform it. They've got their own rules, and essentially if they find internet-facing vulnerabilities that have a CVSS score of 4 or higher, you have to remediate them. It's more or less no questions asked. And then finally there's internal vulnerability scanning, which is where all this starts. The scanning requirement is you have to address all high-risk vulnerabilities with the caveat that it's based on your definition of high risk, which PCI also requires in requirement 6.1, which is have a vulnerability identification program that assigns value to the vulnerabilities based on risk, high, medium, or low. And I will conclude and shut up and let you all argue that this concept actually was introduced with PCI back in 2010, where they first said, and it used to be 6.2, for whatever reason they changed the number, but it was come up with a risk ranking criteria and deal with high risk rankings and so on and so forth. And they give some examples of how to do that. So what I've been saying to my customers since 2010 is you have the opportunity to prioritize your vulnerabilities and reduce what you have to remediate based on come up with a criteria of when compensating controls, mitigations, firewall rules, network segmentation, VLANs, restricted access, whatever. Just write it down and have some criteria that says, if we have some sort of basis of assigning a value to the vulnerabilities that are discovered, and if you do that, you can basically reduce what you have to remediate, or at least how soon you have to remediate. Final thought, and then I'll shut up. All that PCI requires is remediation it requires installation of patches or fixes for any critical security vulnerabilities within 30 days of release or disclosure of the vulnerability. Most industries, most companies don't disclose the vulnerability until they have the fix. So effectively, when the patch comes out, when the fix comes out, you've got 30 days to implement the patch. Think Microsoft Patch Tuesday. That's where the 30-day concept comes in from a PCI perspective. Beyond that, there is no timing in PCI in reference to vulnerability remediation or mitigation. I'll shut up now. Take it away, Josh and others.
We've had 8 PCIs so far, Jeff.
Can you back up a couple of slides? Yeah, I need to go over something. Yeah, perfect. Stop right there.
Yep.
Okay, I want to say a couple of things. Number one, by the way, your points about PCI are well met. The ideas and ideals that they put in here was actually brilliant. And I'm going to say that right off the bat. Absolutely brilliant, okay? But the problems that they're running into are, A, there are things that are not measured, okay, that are not listed, rated, whatever, okay? They don't have CVSS scores because, A, they're either too new, which you do address at a later slide, or they just simply haven't been measured appropriately. Secondly, all exploitable vulnerabilities are corrected. Yeah, that's interesting. I love the word corrected. I need that defined because correction can be a mitigation or countermeasure, whatever you want to call it. Correction can be a root cause analysis. And how many companies have had exploitable vulnerabilities, we'll take it at face value for a moment, that they haven't corrected and have just taken the fines? And the answer is greater than 0, to be very clear.
Sure.
And taking the fines for very, very, very long periods of time. Also, OWASP Top 10. While I have great respect for OWASP, Kevin Johnson's a good friend. He runs Secure Ideas down in Florida, and he runs the OWASP Jacksonville. I talk to him all the time about it. And he tells me that the OWASP Top 10, was designed in a way that was great. And I say, yeah, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Right. It's more complex than that now. So it's difficult. My point is that the measurement of these things, while I'm arguing with Gene, not arguing, I'm discussing with Gene Eric online on the Discord and Dimitri and a couple of others about how the math for a corporation should be simple, okay? Because it has to be for usage. We cannot use unclear terminology. High risk, well, is that highs and criticals? Is that... we have to be very precise in what we say, okay? And I still want, and while I get your point about this, and I'm going to stop with the slides right there. I still think that there is very little scientifically based or empirically based way of scoring, not just the vulnerabilities, but the vulnerabilities measured against the countermeasures or mitigations, whatever term you want, okay? And it's difficult and awkward for companies, and it allows what am I trying to say here? It allows the companies to really game the system. Okay?
So let me try to characterize what I think is the problem. I think it will address what you're trying to say, and maybe I'm just taking a little bit of a different spin on it. I see the big problem as most of the commercial world, most organizations that are trying to do any kind of security, they are, because they don't have expertise, looking for the products and the vendors and the solutions out there to basically tell them what to do. And so they look for in all the tools that they might use, and a lot of their industry marketing and sales is built on don't think about it. We can help you. We'll tell you what's important and what's not. And in contrast, for right or wrong, for better or for worse, PCI says, you, the organization, you get to choose for yourself. Just base it on accepted industry practices and industry standards and industry criteria. But what I like and what I think is everybody's biggest struggle with PCI is it puts it on you to have some sort of understanding and make some sort of value judgment, educational judgment, which, to pull Liam into the conversation, kind of goes, to what Cyrisma is trying to do is, most companies, to make these intelligent, informed decisions have to invest heavily in personnel and product and technology and resources, but most companies don't or can't do that. So how do we help them out? and that's where I think a company like Cyrisma comes in to try to hopefully help them make those kind of decisions. So to me, it's the conflict between you as an organization should know your environment, know what's sensitive, know what your data is, what you're trying to protect, what your overall goal for security is, and make value judgments that we're calling a risk equation or risk tolerance, and do it based on a decent knowledge of what you're trying to do and what you're up against and what you have there to protect it, versus I don't know anything, just throw a whole bunch of technology at me and just tell me what boxes I need to buy, where I need to put them, and what color should the blinky light be. Exactly. And that to me is the curmudgeon-y conflict that
I'm going to quote Dimitri. Dimitri on Discord said, "I'm a fan of elegance in a physics sense. The true nature of something is relatively simple, and if something seems to be complex, there's an underlying mechanism that we don't yet understand. The complex behaviors are emergent properties of simpler things." I love that. Yep. We need to understand risk and countermeasures or mitigation, whatever the hell you want to call it, at a more basic level. We need to understand the measurement of these things at a more basic level. We are complexifying, and that's not a word, but I love it, all of these pieces to a degree that it's bad. We're making it harder for ourselves. We're doing the same thing that fintech people do with derivatives. If you make it complex, they'll just buy it, no questions asked. Yeah. And
because they have budget, or they'll find budget. But especially in today's day and age, where the economy and the world is upside down, most companies don't have deep pockets for investing in things that may or may not work. But it had the coolest blinky light at the time.
Hold on.
But I'm not
Jeff,
saying.
You're picking on. Go ahead, Josh.
Go ahead. I'm not saying that they should spend $1 gazillion on products and more point placement products. Oh my God, more point products. Please God, stop me with point products. And if you want to send me more questionnaires, oh yeah. But what I'm saying is there should be a way that somebody should be able to measure your risk as a company, in a way that allows you to do it in a fairly simple fashion based on what you're doing, who you're doing it with, how you're performing your operations, what countermeasures or mitigating factors, dear God, I don't care, are being put in place, etc. So it should be very, very straightforward and simple. Thank you, Scott, you bastard. She put a picture of the Kool-Aid man in Discord.
I want to add to this. I want to possibly, if I can add to this, right? So if we look at I look at it in the basics aspect is that we try to put things into compartments. Like, for example, what's in scope, what's out of scope, what's internal, what's external. And that from like the SMB market, that just confuses everybody, because then you've got one set of conditions for things in scope. Then you got another set of conditions for internal. Then you got another set of conditions that are external. What we want to try and do is to kind of standardize across the board, because guilty by association. So let's take, for example, DoD. They have classified and unclassified. Does that mean that classified needs to be high security and then low classified needs to be less secure? Because they got that, but guilty by association, if you're less secure and you're you're unclassified, that could affect your classified area. It's the same thing with internal networks as well. Like the easiest way into a network is to walk past the firewall and look at the current paradigm that we're in right now, with the amount of people that are working from home offices that may or may not be patched. And how do we bring that back into the office and thinking that it's patched to potentially understand that something that may not be widely available from an exploitable standpoint in the NVD database and all the rest of it, but it is potentially exploitable because somebody got something on that laptop that they come into the office, and now we've just compromised both in scope and out of scope, whatever aspect. So that's kind of like, think we sometimes compliance sometimes makes it too many words, rather than saying, hey, let's get back to basics and keeping it simple by saying, hey, let's identify a vulnerability. How are we going to mitigate it in a timely fashion? And do we have countermeasures in place to say something that we can't mitigate in a timely manner? Can it reduce the risk of us getting compromised internally or externally?
So
I'm going to agree. Hold on, Scott. I'm throwing host privilege here. I'm agreeing and disagreeing with what you say, Liam. I agree that we should simplify, but simplifying and then focusing immediately on vulnerabilities, if you think back of the risk equation, that's one of three variables within the risk equation. If you're truly simplifying, I think you need to start the conversation with risk. And I wanted to say, I wanted to say it to Josh, to me, simplifying the risk equation in the commercial context, there's only effectively two risks that organizations face. The risk of being able to generate revenue and how much is it going to cost to operate the business. Those are the highest level, the two risks. Everything else we talk about bubbles up to the impact of one of those two items I submit to you. So in terms of simplifying, to your point, Liam, I think everything needs to be discussed within the filter or the context of how is this, which is where the money comes in. How does this impact the bottom line? How does this impact our ability to generate revenue? Scott.
So I'm gonna go against everything y'all have said.
And I'm gonna knock you offline. Go ahead.
No. You can totally knock me offline. That's fine. I mean, if
say it,
Jeff, why'd you do that to me? There's really something key here that you touched on, Jeff, but it hasn't been brought to light. There are two houses that we're dealing with, whether you're government or you're enterprise, and that is those who are above the poverty line and those who are below the poverty line. What is
government being above or below?
Yes, actually, because DoD makes more than HHS.
Yep.
Right. Or FEMA or whatever. Right. You get what I'm saying, right? I may not have that correct. You can totally tell me later. That's fine. But what is the acceptable amount of risk versus how many resources are you trying to put at it? Are you above the cyber poverty line or are you below it?
Who are you asking?
All four of you.
Okay. That I think that's subjective because everybody's operating with a different budget and they have a different budget toleration threshold, not risk tolerance, but money tolerance, if you will.
Well, I guess I would jump in and say that when something bad happens, when a breach occurs, the question then becomes, did you take reasonable steps to protect the data? And I think reasonable probably exists on a sliding scale, depending on who you are. So if you're a startup company, you're going to not be expected to have the same level as the Department of Defense.
Agreed. Yeah.
Hey, John, while you're talking, there was actually a question that came up in the Discord server for you. DMZ is curious what you think about the whole idea of setting the level yourself in terms of organizations defining their own risk levels, risk tolerance levels. And is there a legal liability of not setting it right or making it easier for yourself? As Josh puts it, gaming the system. Your thoughts?
Okay, so you mean here's three different levels with different, costs and different practices.
But my high is Josh's, medium is Scott's low, and it's informational for Liam.
Yeah, well, I think that, God, that would give me heartburn just because I would hate to be a company that said, okay, I'm going to be level 1 or level 2 rather than level 3. Because therein you're admitting that you're not doing everything you can, and you're making an organizational decision to be less secure than you otherwise might. I'd have to give a lot of thought to that, but my first instinct is I don't love it.
Well, is there, from a legal perspective, is there latitude given that, as Josh is complaining, there is no standard, there is no empirical scientific bar that's been set for this concept of evaluating, the risk ranking or the criticality of vulnerabilities?
It's partly a problem with the way the law works because, when you talk about liability, you always come back to the standard of negligence or a reasonable person standard, and it's really binary, right? Either you're negligent or you are not negligent. Most of us walk around in a degree of semi-negligence most of the time, but
it's binary, but isn't it based on, in a legal sense, case law and precedents? I mean, the bar moves or gravitates over time, doesn't it?
So many times, if there's a law or regulation that sets forth what is reasonable, then that's going to be what's reasonable. But if there isn't a standard, or if there isn't a universally accepted standard, then ultimately it's going to be decided by a judge or a jury whether what you did met the conceptual notion of what a reasonable person would do under those circumstances.
The problem, John, is that there are already court cases that can be plucked and pulled and pieced together, right? That already deal with this.
Well, but they're all on their own facts, and there aren't very many cases. Very few of these cases make it far enough that it's going to be litigated and it's going to be taken to trial. And even if they do, it takes 5 years for the case to get through the process. So, you can look at case law for guidance, but all it is guidance.
How much
there's really nothing
of this,
that we
John,
can,
do you think is predicated on?
Go ahead, Jeff.
Organizations, because they lack the institutional knowledge, the ability to make any kind of informed decisions, so they rely on vendors scoring. From a legal perspective, is it more or less acceptable to? Well, I couldn't figure out what was important to me, so I just relied on what vendor told me was important.
Well, if you hire a vendor who's recognized as competent in the field, that is going to generally be considered reasonable. Now, the vendor may mess up, and perhaps you have a lawsuit against the vendor. But that's a reason that people hire outside consultants, is so that when something goes wrong, they have somebody outside to blame.
So how do you determine
in this context?
I'm sorry, hold on, Jeff. Hold on, Jeff. How do you determine what is a competent vendor?
Co-host privilege
in the eyes of the law.
That was essentially my question.
I'm sorry, Jeff.
Specifically, we're talking about scan vendors, and there's the top three. We don't need to name them, but how do you determine that a scan vendor is competent and in a position to make these kind of judgment calls, or has been recognized as authoritative?
If that's challenged, right? So if somebody says, okay, I hired XYZ consultant, and the other side says, well, you're an idiot, this guy didn't know anything, then ultimately somebody like Josh or Scott will come in as an expert witness and testify, yes, that person is, he's on these boards, he's got these credentials. I would consider, as an expert in this field, this person to be a capable person, and it was reasonable for the company to rely on that person.
Well, John, I'm trying to make a distinction here, though, because most of the time we're not talking about consultants and people. We're talking about products. We're talking about scan engines, vulnerability scanners, which are obviously built and maintained by people. But we're talking about products that are known or respected as being vulnerability scan engines that find all the vulnerabilities. Is it possible? How do they achieve this status of they're trusted, and we can defer to what their findings are, versus is it possible to challenge them in terms of the people that are behind the software and the settings and the updates, essentially?
Well, sure, it's always possible to challenge. It would be the same as kind of a product liability analysis. If you have a car, that has an exploding gas tank, even though it's a product, the product may be built defectively. And then the question becomes, should you have known that right before you bought that car and put your employees out in a Pinto? Should you have checked and seen, or were you entitled to rely on the fact that it was a car company, it has regulations, and then the lawsuit would not be against you, it would be against the car company?
So should we have a lemon cyber law now? I'm trying to cut through what you're saying.
Yeah, well,
so help me out here.
Sure, there should be, and I suspect there will emerge rules and regulations on what a product needs to be able to do and to what level. I just don't think the field is mature enough yet, though it's getting there quickly.
I'm afraid our time is nigh. Liam, any other thoughts? And thank you for staying with us.
Oh, no, have I got any more thoughts? I do. I have a scenario, but it's going to take longer than this conversation. So it's around vulnerability management, because I'll just put it out there, and you can leave it for Discord to have a conversation with. So in a situation such as continuous scanning, then how do you apply risk to organizations that cannot keep up with patch management as they're continually scanning and finding vulnerabilities on a continual basis? Then how do we then mitigate and put into context risk around that? Because I find that a little information overload, and then what happens is you get the stale effect of shelfware reports and shelfware things that mitigation doesn't happen as they expect it to do. So that's a question I want to put out there to everybody. Say, what in that situation does that risk calculation come into it when you have continuous scanning? And is that great for organization? Is it impactful? And what value does it bring?
I will respond quickly to that question, and in so close this segment. At a high level, if you think back to the risk equation with the three variables, which are vulnerabilities, threats, and countermeasures, my supposition is that we as an industry and as organizations that look to our industry to solve the security problem so we don't have to think about it because it's too painful and it's too complex, yada, yada, yada. I think we've inordinately focused on one element of the equation, which is the vulnerabilities, much more so than threats, which I think people don't touch threats because, well, they're out there and they happen. They're more or less a constant. I would submit that vulnerabilities, given that we're 30-some years into this and, there's god-awful vulnerabilities, in terms of quantities, there's so many vulnerabilities that are continuing to be discovered. I would submit to you that we've paid too much attention to the vulnerability variable. Which is more or less a constant. They're always there. The threat is always there. What we haven't focused on, and what I submit as a rhetorical question is, if it's not about vulnerability and vulnerability remediation and management, if it's not about threat analysis, threat detection, if it's that third element, which is countermeasures, what's left? What is there left to do that doesn't have to do with vulnerabilities and threats, but is designed in terms of a risk equation to lower risk? What is this thing we call countermeasure? I suggest that maybe that's what security in essence is all about, but what is it? I will drop that rhetorical, curmudgeon-y, philosophical bomb on everyone. Thank you, Liam, for joining us in this conversation. As we suspected on Discord early on, we didn't answer the question. We didn't come to a conclusion, but that's the nature of security after all. That's why we have jobs. Thanks everyone for joining us. Stay tuned next week. We're going to have a compliance discussion. Next week is actually our first anniversary, so I suspect we're gonna take some time to reflect back, maybe look forward. We invite interaction on Discord, or go to securityweekly.com / whatever the thing is for the fill out the guest form. If you have ideas of what you want us to talk about, we will gladly embrace them and bring them up on the show next week as we celebrate our first anniversary of Security Compliance Weekly. Thanks to my co-hosts. Go out, be secure, be compliant, manage your risk, tolerate your risk, whatever that means. We're out.